Welcome, everybody, to our second webinar of the season, an in-depth look into using TreeAzin for the control of Hemlock woolly Adelgid. Thanks for taking the time to attend today. My name is Allison Windmill, and I lead the Forestry Technical Marketing Trials here at Lalamon Plant Care. The webinar will be recorded today, and it will be posted on our website for future reference shortly after the presentation. Today, our webinar will be led by Elsa Cousineau, our Forestry Technical Representative. So take it away, Elsa.
Thanks, Al. All right, everyone, let's dive right in. So if you're not familiar with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, you soon will be. It seems that, HWA or Hemlock woolly Adelgid is spreading pretty rapidly these days. It's currently located in southern Ontario in regions like Niagara Falls, in Wainfleet, Fort Erie, and Pelham, and more recently in eastern Ontario in Grafton. And of course, it's been quickly spreading in old growth hemlock groves in southwestern Nova Scotia since 2017. Now, a lot of you are very familiar with TreeAzin and its efficacy against the emerald ash borer, but some of you may be less familiar with its use for Hemlock woolly Adelgid. So let's take a deeper look and see how you can incorporate it in your treatment plans. So I'd like to spend a few minutes to review our product. TreeAzin is a systemic insecticide with an Azadirachtin formulation. So it's not a contact or a topical insecticide. It has to be ingested for it to be effective. The active ingredient is Azadirachtin, and the Azadirachtin is derived from a botanical source. It was developed by the CFS, so the Canadian Forest Service, in collaboration with Bioforest in the early aughts. And they still hold the intellectual property of the product while we have a worldwide license to manufacture and distribute. So TreeAzin can be used on deciduous and coniferous species against a variety of insect pests, which makes it an ideal tool to control such pests like spongy moth, budworm, and more importantly for us today, Hemlock woolly Adelgid. For those of you who are less familiar with Azadirachtin, it's an extract from the neem tree seed kernel, and it should not be confused with neem oil. Neem oil is the crude component that you get when you press neem plant material together. So think leaves, twigs, fruit, whereas Azadirachtin is really what is extracted from the seed kernel itself once it's been processed. Now, the neem tree grows primarily in Southeast Asia, and if you have a look here on the map, these shaded areas are where plantations are popping up. Its popularity has really steadily increased over the years, and you might see some neem products in natural health food stores. Many people believe that products made from neem trees have antifungal, antibacterial, sedative, and even antiviral properties. But what makes it really interesting for us is that it's toxic to a wide range of insect pests, so basically molting organisms. And since mammals or humans don't molt, the risk of toxicity to us is extremely minimal. So HWA attacks and kills eastern hemlock trees by feeding on nutrients at the base of hemlock needles. This ultimately reduces new shoot growth and causes grayish green foliage, premature needle drop, thin crowns, and branch tip dieback, and eventual tree death. Tree mortality can occur as soon as 2 years post-infestation or take up to 10 years, really depending on site conditions and other stressors that the trees might be suffering, like drought, for example. So infested stands often suffer complete mortality. So it's a pretty devastating insect. HWA can spread by wind, animals, nursery stock, wood movement such as logs or firewood, and human movement. In fact, the active crawlers, the first instar, appear at the time of northward bird migration, and it's thought that they can move long distances hanging on to these birds. Their rapid life cycle also allows for an increase in speed, in spread, and population. On this slide here, we have a fantastic image from the Invasive Species Center that gives us a clear timeline of HWA life cycle. So HWA has 2 different generations and 3 forms within 1 year. The 2 generations are called systems, which are also referred as the overwintering generation, and progrediens, also known as the spring generation, all of which are female and reproduce asexually. The cystin generation is present from June until March of the following year, while the progrediens generation is present for 4 months from March until June. And now both of these generations have 6 stages of development: eggs, nymphal instars, and adults. Now, the second generation can produce 2 forms of adults. The first form is wingless, which basically stays on the hemlock, and the second form is called sexuperae, which has wings and migrates to spruce trees. Now, there are no appropriate spruce species here that support HWA, so we're not too worried about this form reproducing. However, once the progrediens generation adults lay eggs on a hemlock, the cystins generation hatches in June, July, and these newly hatched first instars are known as crawlers, and they're the only mobile stage for this insect. So once they find a spot to feed, they become inactive for the remainder of the summer, which is why if you look on the diagram right over here, it is scratched out. And then in mid-October, that crawler will resume feeding and continue to develop as a nymph, feeding throughout the winter when conditions are warm enough, and then go through more instars before becoming adults in the spring by early May. Now, these adults will produce a single ovisac containing up to 300 eggs, which will hatch and produce progrediens, which will then complete its life cycle in 4 months. So if there's one slide I would like you to remember, it's probably this one. How does TreeAzin, or more specifically, how does Azadirachtin affect HWA? Well, it works in 2 ways. As we know, HWA's feeding activity injures hemlocks by withdrawing the plant sap and nutrients. So by doing so, they are ingesting the product in the cambial layer. And once they do, the azadirachtin will basically act as a growth regulator. So if the nymphs ingest some azadirachtin, they won't be able to molt into their next instar, which will effectively interrupt their growth. The other way it works is in the female adults. So once the female adults have ingested TreeAzin from a treated tree, they'll lay less eggs, and the eggs that they do lay won't be viable, effectively suppressing future HWA populations. Now, this is a slide here that I often use in other TreeAzin presentations, but you might wonder why I'm using it now. There's always been a lot of talk on bees and bee health in particular, and we've always been interested in TreeAzin's toxicity to bees. On TreeAzin's label, it states that it is toxic to bee brood. Basically, in order for azadirachtin to be toxic to bees, it would have to reach the bee hive and find itself in the young bee larvae. So as we know, when we're measuring toxicity, we use the amount of a toxic agent that is sufficient to kill 50% of a population of animals, usually within a certain time, so the LD50, which is also called the median lethal dose. So basically, the larger the amount, in this case measured in micrograms per bee, the less toxic it is to the target. So if we have a look at our chart here, we can see that it would take 6.1 micrograms of azadirachtin to be fatal to 50% of a controlled bee population. Whereas in contrast, it would take anywhere from 0.24 to 0.0179 micrograms of imidacloprid to be considered toxic to bees. And then again, even less so for dinotefuran and emamectin benzoate. And so by EPA's scale for rating toxicity, azadirachtin is considered moderately toxic to bees, while other active ingredients used for HWA treatments, namely imidacloprid and dinotefuran, are highly toxic. Now you might ask, do bees actually forage on hemlock pollen? Well, according to a few sources, including Michigan State University, hemlock trees produce large amounts of pollen in the spring, but this pollen is not a nutritious food source for bees. However, because hemlock pollen can dust all the surrounding plants for several weeks, bees can be exposed to trace amounts that mix with the pollen of more preferred plants. Another concern is neighboring flowering plants may pick up systemic insecticides from soil treatments of hemlocks if the plant's root systems overlap. So basically, a treatment method that mitigates this risk is to apply systemic insecticides through trunk injection. Here we have a list of insect pests found on TreeAzin's label. TreeAzin is registered in Canada and the United States for treatment against HWA, as we know, but it's also registered for treatments against other insect pests like EAB, spongy moth, spruce budworm, European elm scale, and sawflies. And so a low dosage of TreeAzin is required to effectively control HWA. We're looking at 3 mils per centimeter of DBH, making it a viable option in terms of environmental impact. So this means that we're going to be using, a different dosing table than the one we typically use for emerald ash borer. We want to make sure that we use the 3 mil green dosing table found at the back of the EcoJect system manual in the appendix. It's critical that you follow the chart because it'll give you the exact amount you need in order to ensure that the tree receives 100% of the dose it needs. So we recommend that copies are made or that the applicator carry a copy of this chart while in the field. It'll tell you exactly how many canisters you need and how many of each size you may need for each tree. So in this example here, a tree of 22 centimeters in diameter will require 6 8 mil canisters and 1 20 mil canister for a total of 7 injection sites. Now, don't forget to use the dosing rate table while you're even drawing up quotes. You'll be able to tell exactly how much product will be needed for each tree size. Another difference you might notice with this dosing chart is the ratio between 8 mils and 20 mils is the complete opposite of treating for EAB. When we're using 3 mils per centimeter, we're using a lot more of the smaller 8 mil canisters. So make sure you have enough of those in your inventory before you start the season. So in terms of treatment efficacy for HWA, results to date show that TreeAzin injected at 3 mils per centimeter of DBH significantly reduces HWA densities at 5, 8, and 12 months post-treatment. At 2 years post-treatment, however, there is no difference in densities of live HWA on trees and treated trees versus untreated trees. But treated trees had more current year's shoot growth, suggesting that they were much healthier than untreated trees. So it's important to note that we will still see some defoliation in treated trees, and this is normal. Remember that TreeAzin's mode of action means that the pest needs to ingest some TreeAzin for the product to be effective. So it's very important to manage our expectations. This isn't a quick kill of HWA, but we'd like them to feed a little bit for them to absorb some TreeAzin. So over the next few slides, we'll review TreeAzin's environmental impacts. When we're looking at the environmental profile of TreeAzin, a question we can ask ourselves is, when the leaves or needles of a treated tree fall to the ground, what does that mean for the decomposer invertebrates, the earthworms, the snails, slugs, the bacteria and mushrooms, basically that whole ecosystem. And so this is a research paper published by Dr. David Kreutzweiser, where he tested the residues of TreeAzin in leaf material so that he could see if they would have an impact on those critters. So it's important to remember that whatever product you're using, there's always a risk of ground contamination from leaf material. But after his studies, he came to the conclusion that the Azadirachtin concentration in that foliage would likely pose very little risk of harm to those critters, to those decomposer invertebrates. And now since then, similar studies have also been done with hemlock, and so far there haven't been any concerns, which is good news. It's good news because hemlock trees are commonly found in riparian areas where their dense canopies play an important role in providing cooler, darker, and sheltered environments for a variety of species of animals, birds, and plant communities. Basically, their canopies regulate and maintain water temperatures for fish species and provide steam bank stabilization. So unlike other insecticides, TreeAzin doesn't need a buffer for application. So this means that you can treat hemlock trees growing along these edge habitats with no problem. Another question that often comes up is, once we inject the product, what happens to it and how quickly does it start to work? So this is another research project that measured quantifiable amounts of TreeAzin in the foliage a few hours after injection. The results state that complete translocation of the product within the crown happens within 48 hours after the injection process. And on top of that, as we saw earlier, essentially all of the TreeAzin dissipates within leaf material prior to leaf fall. And there are no quantifiable levels of TreeAzin that are found in the brand new shoots or the next year's foliage, for instance. Which brings us to the question of whether TreeAzin should be an annual or biannual application. TreeAzin inhibits larval development and damage when injected in early spring, prior to bud burst, or when injected to the previous fall. So it's recommended to monitor HWA populations annually and treat once per year as needed. Of course, if the pest pressure does not warrant treatment, there's no need to inject. So in the previous slide, I mentioned spring and fall treatments. For Hemlock woolly Adelgid, we want to keep in mind its complicated life cycle. So since there's quite a bit of feeding activity in the spring and fall, our recommendations are to treat in April and early May, or we can also treat in the fall in October to November, or until the ground freezes. So you might be scratching your head, you might be asking, well, I thought that TreeAzin could only be used up until the end of August or the end of September. Well, last fall, TreeAzin's label language was finally amended to allow for fall treatments of certain pests. Now treatments can occur up until the ground freezes and can then resume in April. So essentially, the treatment window for TreeAzin is now April up until the end of November. Now, it's important to remember that not every tree is treatable. Obviously, we won't be treating a tree that has a 90% canopy dieback, just because it won't have the necessary vascular system to effectively draw the product up into the canopy. And at that point, there isn't much to save anyway. We like to say that the limit for canopy dieback when treating any tree is usually about 30%. Anything more than 30% might compromise treatment effectiveness. And this can be a bit tricky because 30% for one person might not be 30% for someone else. It can be pretty subjective. However, there are tools available to help you determine canopy density, like canopy density handheld ocular tools, binoculars, and there are even some pretty good phone apps out there that help you quantify canopy. Another thing to keep in mind is that dieback can also happen very quickly. Sometimes we can assess trees in June and note that they have 30% canopy dieback. And when we arrive to treat in, a little bit later in the fall, perhaps, that tree now has a 60% crown dieback. So it can happen very, very quickly with HWA. It can also depend on other stresses that the tree might be experiencing throughout the year on top of being affected by the pest, like drought, mechanical damage, soil compaction. These are all things to look out for when evaluating the crown of the tree. So when a tree has lost about 30% of its foliage, we consider that that tree is no longer treatable, simply because the vascular system of that tree has already been overly compromised. And whatever you're injecting at the base likely will have a hard time to make its way up to the top of the crown. Another good sign is to look for new shoots on hemlocks. Are the trees otherwise healthy and showing new growth? Have a look at neighboring trees also. Perhaps the one you are considering treating seems fine, but the others around it are very defoliated, indicating strong pest pressure that could affect your treatment and your tree. So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in a really short amount of time. So just quickly, I'd like to go over this slide here, just a few points that I think are important to remember. So when we're treating for HWA, our dosing rate is 3 mils per centimeter of diameter. Our treatments should happen in April and May, or October and November. Remember to assess the tree's health prior to injection. And if the assessment was done in the spring and you're treated in the fall, it's a good idea to reassess the tree condition in the fall prior to treatment. Do not inject more than once per year. An additional treatment of a different application method could potentially be conducted that same year. So for example, if we were to inject 1 year, we could follow it up with a basal bark spray that could provide a longer residual of a different active. It's also really important to remember to clean your boots, your pants, your shirt, your toque, gloves, basically anything that could provide a ride for those tiny little bugs to spread elsewhere. I find that a bleach bath for your boots works really well, and so does a sticky lint roller, just to drag around your clothing after you leave an infested site works really well. Now, TreeAzin is a fantastic option for heavily infested trees, and those heavily infested trees often require a quick knockback of populations, and so this is where TreeAzin can really shine. But it can also be used in collaboration with another treatment, like I mentioned, like a basil bark spray that might take a bit longer to get to work. And because TreeAzin dissipates naturally within the foliage over the course of the season, and there are no quantifiable amounts of TreeAzin present in new foliage or new shoots, HWA treatments should be considered annual. Now, that brings me to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to discuss anything I covered here further, please feel free to contact our support team via email. So that's support@lalamonplantcare.com. And if you'd like to place an order, simply give our order desk a call or send them an email. So I will leave it at that. Thanks, everyone.